Hi everyone, it's Jakov, and due to a new version of Last Alliance Total War being released, I'm here to cover the newest faction added to the mod, the Kingdom of Eryn Galen. If you're new here, the Last Alliance Total War is a mod for Total War Shogun 2 set in the Second Age of Middle-earth, being somewhat of a prequel timeline-wise to Total War The Dawnless Days, a mod for Total War Attila set in the Third Age instead. As of making this video, the mod is in development, being in the version 0.3.7 alpha, progressively getting closer to a full release, currently having many factions and a campaign ready to play. For those of you interested in the mod, I'm going to leave it linked in the description, and I do encourage you to play. Today's video, as I said, will be a faction breakdown, with me going over the history within both the books and the films of Tolkien's universe of the Kingdom of Eryn Galen before looking at the civilizations that inspired it in real life. After that, I'm going to look at the faction's units and break them down, covering their battlefield roles as well as looking at their equipment and seeing how historically authentic it is. The Kingdom of Eryn Galen, better known as the Woodland Realm, was the easternmost major elven kingdom, being situated among the trees of Greenwood the Great. Originally founded by the elves who refused to travel over the misty mountains to reach the Undying Lands, in the aftermath of the War of Wrath at the end of the First Age, many elves from the Kingdom of Doriath would migrate to the eastern forest, among them the noble elf Orifer, who would set himself up as king over the area. His kingdom comprised of a majority of Sylvan elves and a Sindarin elite. Throughout the Second Age, Eryn Galen would find peace, although as shadows began to rise in the east, the elves ever found themselves being drawn into conflict with Sauron, despite the isolationist policies of Orifer, who attempted to distance himself as much as possible from the high elves who he hated, instead attempting to return the old ways of the elves before they met the Valar. Eventually, when the War of the Last Alliance broke out, the elves of Eryn Galen would fight, although due to Orifer's refusal to accept a position under Gil-galad, the High King of the Elves, much of the Woodland Realm strength would be lost in the fighting, the elves of Lothlorien also choosing to join battle unsupported by their allies, leading to slaughter. By the end of the War of the Last Alliance, the Woodland Realm was much diminished, and with Orifer's death, Thranduil, his heir, would take control of the kingdom till the Fourth Age of Middle-earth. During the Third Age, the Woodland Realm would suffer constant raids and attacks from the evil fortress Dol Guldur, the great fortress coming to earn the name Mirkwood. Near the end of the Third Age, the elves of the Woodland Realm would partake in the Battle of the Five Armies before being assailed by Orcish armies and pushing them back to Dol Guldur, alongside Galadriel during the War of the Ring, the Fourth Age seeing the kingdom fade into history peacefully. The Kingdom of Eryn Galen appears very prominently in both the Hobbit films and book, a major part of the story being spent there and with its people, though the films do expand on the role of the Elves of Mirkwood, originally being antagonists to Thorin's company, although they do transition to allies by the end of the story. In the Lord of the Rings films and books, Eryn Galen barely appears with one exception, the character of Legolas, who was the Prince of Mirkwood and the son and grandson of Thranduil and Orifer, so in a way, the Woodland Realm more than makes itself felt in Lord of the Rings, even if its actual presence is minute. In terms of culture which may have inspired the Kingdom of Eryn Galen, the one that comes closest to mind are the native tribes of North America, who weren't as technologically advanced as other emerging cultures on the continent and lived much closer to nature, the guerrilla tactics of the Woodland Realm aligning quite nicely with the warfare practiced by the native tribes. With the history of the faction both in and out of universe looked at, let's look at its units beginning with its generals. Unlike in the Dawnless Days where generals can sometimes be more elite units that can be used multiple times in one army, the generals in this mod are unique, with each faction generally only having two generals, the Kingdom of Eryn Galen also having two general options. The first of those two options are the Sindar Greenleaf Guard, an elite unit of archers. Looking at their equipment, it's quite similar to that used by the Elves of Lothlorien, but differs in some ways. Their helmets are engraved with tree patterns, are the standard elven helms we've seen shared by many elven units, looking to be inspired by the ancient Greek Corinthian helmet, although these helmets come with a spike that's reminiscent of the one adorning the Witch King of Angmar's helmet. Looking at the rest of their armour, they wear a scale hauberk uniformly over which they wear surcoats decorated with green tree emblems on them, the upper part of their legs having what looks like a leather buff coat skirt covering the scale armour, which is a bit odd. One thing to note is that I've been informed by the mod creators that the reason why every unit more or less has a rider split when it comes to their armour is due to a limitation in game, so I'm going to avoid pointing that out from now on. Personally though, I think that these warriors shouldn't have had the skirts over their hauberk's lower half, as I feel it makes the unit look a bit cluttered when it comes to design, although I fully admit it's a personal preference thing. Turning to the rest of their armour, these elves have plate spoilers protecting their shoulders and upper arms, while their forearms are covered in beautifully shaped van braces that wouldn't look out of place in the 16th century. Finally, to cap it off, their lower legs are protected by pretty basic plate greaves, while the warriors wear green cloaks and masks to help them blend into the forest. For weapons, the elves use wonderfully decorated longbows, while slung over their backs, they have a set of long dirks, shorter knife-like blades designed for close combat, very much like the ones you see Legolas and Tauriel use in Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit films. Looking at the unit officer, he's identical to his troops except that his helmet is slightly more decorated. Overall, the unit being fairly lightly armoured for a general unit, which makes sense given the lesser martial abilities and technological skill of the elves of the Woodland Realm. As a unit, their appearance and equipment is very much a reflection of their battlefield capabilities. The unit being amazing at hitting enemies from afar with devastating volleys, specifically being well suited to hit and run stealth attacks on the open battlefield, due to being able to remain hidden in any environment. In close combat they can defend fairly well from standard melee infantry, although shock infantry and cavalry will tear them apart. The unit for all intents and purposes being a beefed up ranger unit. I'd recommend picking these guys up as a budget general option, which provides you extra stealthy firepower at a pinch, although keeping them out of melee is very much to be advised. Overall, a cool unit, although I'd be lying if I said I didn't find the next one slightly cooler. Moving on to the faction's second general option, we have Orifer, the first king of Eryn Galen leading the Cinder Flower Crown Guard. Equipped identically to the previous unit when it comes to armour and longbow, these elves have a glaive straight out of the 15th century slung over their backs, as well as metal-rimmed shields which resemble more or less a cross between a kite shield and a pavise shield. Similar, but not the same as the iconic metal shields used by the High Elves, these shields being enamelled green and decorated with metal leaves and a green tower. Finally, to round out their weapons, the elves have axes out of the 14th century at their side. Overall, while the elves look quite cool with all this equipment, it seems a bit much, being very impractical to keep all this stuff on one warrior's back. If the unit had just the glaive or the longbow it would have worked, but with both, the elves look like they're about to fall over, all the equipment really stretching the plausibility of this unit being as stealthy as the previous one. While it may seem like a nitpick, it really does appear to me as if these elves are also suffering from having too much in their design. Moving on to Orifer himself, he wears a surcoat decorated with a flowering tree which helps differentiate him from his guards, as does his helmet which is the same basic shape as his troops, but is modified to have a decorated crown built into it, distinguishing Orifer on the battlefield. Overall, as a unit, while they may have some design issues in my mind, the unit is fantastic on the battlefield and the jack-of-all-trades equipment works, the longbows allowing them to be extremely deadly at range while deployed as stealthy raiders hitting the enemy's flanks and rear, while their shields and glaives make them a credible threat to enemy cavalry and gives the unit the ability to take up position in a shield war that the previous unit fundamentally couldn't. Finally, if the unit is forced to go into battle out of formation, their melee skills mean they can handle themselves quite well, although I should stress that these guys are significantly better as a defending unit than they are as an offensive one. As long as I can afford to recruit them, I'd pick them over the previous unit all day long. With Orifer and his unit covered, we'll move on to the spear infantry of the faction fields, beginning with the least of them, the Tawa-Waith clan spearmen. The Sylvan Elves were originally known as the Tawa-Waith Elves, so for all intents and purposes this unit is a volunteer force comprised of the disparate clans of Sylvan Elves mustered in Eryn Galen. For armour, they have none, only having surcoats that might miraculously be gambeson, that is to say padded textile armour, but appears more like these elves are just wearing regular robes. Apart from that dubious armour, they have green van braces which look to be boiled leather decorated with tree designs. Leather van braces were known to have existed, and given how deficient in metal and metal making these elves are, it makes sense to me that these elves would rely on organic armour more so than metal, especially for the least of their warriors. Apart from the van braces, the elves just wear hoods, which help to conceal them from prying eyes. Turning to their weapons, they use spears with long heads, the spears looking like they do equally well at cutting as well as stabbing, while for shields they use a roughly octagonal shield with metal rims. The shield reminding me of a cross between a large buckler and the rodolero shields used by the Spanish at the end of the Middle Ages. Turning to the unit officer, he uses the same spear and shield as his men, but has a mail shirt, basic helmet, greaves and van braces, being quite a step up in terms of defense. As a unit, these guys are a basic component of your early armies, being the wall that protects your archers from encroaching enemies. While they can stand toe-to-toe with most equivalent foes, the fact that the unit possesses insane stealth abilities allowing it to practically march right up to the enemy without being detected means it can be used to ambush the enemy any way possible on the battlefield, forcing them to play into your strategies. Overall, a very useful unit, although they do become outclassed very quickly. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Tawar Waith Beach Glaives. More heavily armoured than the clan spearmen, these warriors share a similarity with most other second tier spear units, that being that they discard shields and instead rely on their weapons and improved armour to protect them, this trend being most prominently seen in the Haradrim rosters. For armour, these warriors have the standard elven helm, face mask and cloak combination, while the rest of their bodies are well armoured, having mail hauberks underneath their fabric tabards, their forearms and shins being protected by the same plate vambraces and greaves seen before. As I said before, they discard shields and instead use the elven glaive, which is commonly seen and used by many elven units, being a more offensive weapon than the hewing spears used by the previous unit. In addition to the glaives that give the unit its name, they have curved daggers at their side in case of close combat. Turning to their officer, he has the same helmet, greaves and vambraces as men, but differs in his torso armour, having a scale shirt with mail sleeves and a mail skirt. As far as I'm aware, I haven't seen such a combination of armour in one hauberk, although it may well exist. Over his upper arms, his look is completed with spolders. As a unit, these guys are purely a massive leap up from the starting spear unit, and as such I recommend recruiting them the moment they become available, their stealth abilities giving them just as much usefulness but at a higher level. Specifically, the offensive nature of this unit means that while it's not quite as great as some other equivalent spearmen when on the defensive, it can deal out quite a bit of damage when used offensively, in fact being capable of acting as quasi-shock infantry, which helps set it apart. Moving on to the next unit, we have the defensive counterpart to the Green Glaives, the Tawar Waith Green Spears. Equipped almost identically to the previous unit, these warriors have the same spears as the clan spearmen, indicating their more defensive nature, something confirmed by the unit's adoption of shields, specifically metal-rimmed kite shields enamelled with green tree symbology that look like less advanced versions of the metal-sheathed Noldoran shields, these shields being a great match for the relative lightness of these warriors' armour. Skipping the officer who's the same as the previous unit but with a different spear and shield, these guys are best used in combination with the green glaives near the mid-game, balancing out your army quite nicely and giving you the ability to go on the offensive with your other infantry, while these guys buy time and protect your flanks from being enveloped. Overall, a critical unit with excellent stealth abilities that can't be skipped over by a prospective Eryn Galen general. Moving on to the next unit, we have the peak of the faction spear line, the Sindar Greenleaf Glaives. Bearing the same armour as the previous unit's officer but with the spiked helmets of the general units, these troops discard shields and spears and instead pick up glaives again, the unit officer only being differentiated by his fully scale hauberk. As a unit, these guys are the closest thing you're going to get to heavy professional infantry, overall possessing great all-around stats, being a combination of the previous two units in terms of role, equally adept at being offensive shock infantry or defensive squares. I'd recommend recruiting these guys en masse if you can, as their flexibility when it comes to their role, their stealth traits, and their ability to stand up to equivalent enemy units makes them crucial for late game professional armies, although they are outperformed by more elite units filtered by the more advanced factions. Overall, a must-have unit and one that follows the trend of this faction so far, having no surplus units that can be overlooked. With these guys covered, all the spear infantry of the faction have been looked at, so let's turn to the sole melee infantry unit the faction has, the Tawar Waith Headhunters. Equipped very similarly to the Tawar Waith Beach Glaives when it comes to armour, some of these warriors have mail hauberks with sleeves underneath the tabards, while some have hauberks lacking sleeves, the main thing setting this unit apart being its choice of weapons. Every elf in this unit dual wields what could be described as long curved daggers or curved short swords, being, if I remember correctly, the only unit in this mod that dual wields in such a fashion. The blades somewhat remind me of the Seeker knives of antiquity used in ancient Romania, although these weapons don't have as much of an upturn point. Skipping their officer who we've seen before, as a unit these troops are for all intents and purposes the closest thing to a mix of shock infantry and melee infantry the faction has, nailing home the point that you have to rely on your spearmen if you want to win. While they do have their stealth ability the other units possess, I don't really see that being much of a use for them in armies, except as maybe as a mobile reserve. Personally, I believe the equivalent spearmen do everything these guys do but better, so apart from the gimmick of dual wielding, I don't think they have so much to offer, so I'd skip them. With that unit covered, we can move on to another strength of the faction, its archer lineup. beginning with the Tawar Waith clan archers. For all intents and purposes bow-equipped clan spearmen, but with the longbows we saw previously, this is an excellent starting unit, a core building block of your army whose combination of stealth and long range means you can rain death from afar, and from early on, build your army on hitting the enemy hard and fast while invisible. Well, I suggest seeding the battlefield with a few of these guys ahead of your main line. Keep in mind that they are supremely vulnerable to melee combat, so avoiding enemy horsemen and infantry is a must, being engaged in shootouts also not being that great of an idea. Moving on, we come to the Tawar Waith Borderlanders, who are equipped identically to the headhunters except for their choice of weapons, having both a longbow and a spear. This unit vindicates my earlier comments about the general unit being too heavily equipped, as this unit cuts a perfect balance, discarding the shield and being able to enter long and close range fights at a pinch. Stats wise, this unit is quite good, having relatively middling combat stats, but being amazing archers, having great range. Overall, this unit helps eliminate one of the major weaknesses of archers, cavalry, with their spears helping to solve that problem. While they aren't great against shock infantry or grinding down hordes of enemy infantry, the fact that they can hold their own against horsemen means that I suggest filling up your army with as many of them as possible, perhaps even making them the core around which your army is built. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Tawar Waith North Guard. Armour wise, these troops look like much of what we've seen before, however their torsos are supremely armoured, having mail hauberks underneath banded plate cuirasses, which are either decorated to look like they're made of segmented plates, or are actually segmented like the Roman lorica segmentata. In combination with their armour, these troops use bows and large two-handed axes somewhat reminiscent of the Norse and Anglo-Saxon Dane axes. As a unit, these guys are essentially shock infantry merged with bowmen of the highest calibre, the shock equivalent to the previous unit. These guys work quite well in combination with them for mid-game armies, each covering the other's blind spot as it were. While these guys aren't capable of warding off enemy cavalry the way that the Borderlanders can, this unit can serve as your army's win condition in a way that defensive spearmen never could, carving through enemy units until they break rather than holding them and pinning them down. Personally, I'd say that the Borderlanders are better suited for stopping you from losing battles, while the Northguard is better at winning them for you. With these guys covered, we come to the last archer unit available, the Sindar Greenleaf Archers. Equipped identically to the Sindar Greenleaf Glaives, these troops use long bows and dual-wield the short swords on their backs. Skipping their officer who we've seen before, stats-wise this unit blows the previous two archers out of the water, which makes sense for the faction's professional archer unit. However, as a unit, these guys are more or less a return to standard army building doctrine, as in combination with their glaive equivalent, they are the two axes around which your professional to elite armies are built, compared to the previous units, which rolled two rolls into one unit. While these guys are amazing stealthy marksmen who can also wail on enemies in close combat, they are highly vulnerable to cavalry, which for me seems like you're taking a step back in development and flexibility. While they, like their glaive counterparts, are crucial for late game army builds, I can't help but feel like there could have been more to this unit, or at least the most elite units the faction has access to. With these guys covered, we'll move on to the last type of unit the faction can field, cavalry, beginning with the Tawar Waith Clan Scouts. Essentially the clan spearmen on horseback, but with mail shirts underneath their clothes. These elves ride unarmoured horses, having a spear for use in charges against enemies, and a longbow slung over their back for shooting while on horseback. As I've said before, a recurve bow would be a better choice for mounted archers, as these were traditionally used opposed to longbows, which are too long and unwieldy to use on horseback. Looking at the officer, the main point of interest with him is his torso, which appears to be protected by plated mail, which was an Indian and Persian style of armour from the 16th century and later on, in which plates were linked to mail, but there was no mail behind the plates. A very cool type of armour, and one that if you want to find out more about, we'll have a video from the content creator Lindy Beige linked to in the video description. Overall, as a unit, these are your standard light-mounted raiders who can pivot between shooting enemy formations then charging into strung-out infantry. Due to their elven nature, these bowmen can outrange many foot archer units, which gives them an advantage over similar mounted units, although I'd suggest keeping them far from spearmen and tougher horsemen, this unit very much being a great fusion of light shock cavalry and ranged power. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Tawar Waith Deer Riders, who as their name suggests, ride unarmoured deer, something I really like and which I believe is inspired by the mount of King Thranduil in the Hobbit films. Armour-wise, these warriors are essentially the green leaf glaives but on deer back, however, with plated mail for their torsos, having the kite shields seen previously used in combination with also previously seen spears. As a unit, these guys are the heavy hitters of your army, being a mobile armoured fist which excels at charging it and causing havoc. Best used in cycle charges, I keep these guys away from melee cavalry, spearmen, and archers, clearing the path of your archers so as to allow these guys uncontested passage. A major strength that benefits both this unit and the previous one is that they also have stealth abilities, meaning that your enemy can unexpectedly have cavalry appear at the flank or rear of their army ready to carry out a game-changing charge. Overall, a fine and unique addition to the faction's roster that I foresee will be getting a lot of use. Moving on to the final mounted unit of Eryn Galen and the faction as a whole, we have the Sindar Ammon Lank Riders. Armoured identically to the general units, these elves ride unarmoured steeds, wielding a one-handed axe in one hand and a shield in the other, the axe being reminiscent of those used by Persian cavalry in the early modern period. As for the shield, it's a larger and more ornate version of the kind used by the clan spearmen, having more metal and engraved designs on it. Fulfilling the role of melee cavalry, these horsemen excel at getting stuck into enemy units and staying in the fight, specifically shock cavalry who if caught out are rendered significantly weaker after being unable to carry out a charge, leaving them easy pickings. Best used as a support unit to help keep opposing melee cavalry off of your shock cavalry. Once the enemy horse has been driven from the field, you can use them to whittle down enemy infantry formations. Overall, a fairly useful unit that finds itself fulfilling its own role at its own pace. With these guys covered, every unit in the faction has been looked at, so let's move on to the faction as a whole. The Kingdom of Eryn Galen is one that truly exemplifies the idea of trying to find your own niche and succeeding spectacularly. While initially I suspected it would be similar to Edelon and Lothlorien, due to the same general circumstances all share, I turned out to be wrong, and Eryn Galen is quite unique. Sharing the same stealth-oriented abilities as those factions, the armies of the Woodland Realm take a completely different route than the highly aggressive axemen used by those factions, instead abandoning melee infantry almost completely, relying on stealth spearmen and archers to whittle down enemy armies and draw them closer to destruction in early game builds, before progressing to armies comprised of dual role units, covering each other's weaknesses. Finally, for late game armies, the faction relies on fairly standard stealth units combined with surprisingly powerful and flexible cavalry to eke out victories. With their notable lack of melee infantry, I say that this faction more than solidifies itself as one of, if not the most, unique factions in the mod. With all that said, my breakdown of the Kingdom of Eryn Galen is over, and up until a new update is released for the Last Alliance Total War, this will be my last video breaking down faction rosters. Although given how quickly the amazing modders work, I don't think we'll be waiting too long for a new update. That said, I'll be back soon with new videos for both this mod and the Dawnless Days, such as battle videos and army builds. If you've made it this far, please like and subscribe. It might not seem like much, but for such a small channel, it's greatly appreciated. This is your host Jakov, signing out.